The press covered it. I remember, and to this day, Brigadier Hughes, who was then the Chief Medical Officer of the 8th Corps, which actually liberated the camp. 8th Corps was on our right at the time, as we advanced across Germany towards the Baltic Sea. The press that time gave full coverage, and for the first time I think the world realized the full enormity of the crime which had been committed. When there was action was taken, the camp was closed off at that time. But I remember a friend of mine, Lieutenant Sington, who was now with the BBC. He was among the very first to enter with a psychological warfare unit in order to take control of that camp, incidentally. Shortly thereafter, when we were resting before the final push northwards to Bremen and to the Cuxhaven Peninsula, I got permission to nip over and have a look for myself. I thought I might find, I too had relations who had been deported from France, and well, it's very, very difficult to describe the whole atmosphere there at the time. Of course, a lot had been cleaned up by the time I arrived, but the mass graves, the human skeletons, the incredible smell which hung around that place for a long, long time thereafter, the smell of death which hung all over the place. The Hungarian guards, because a good part of the force which guarded Bergen-Belsen was incidentally Hungarian. They were still wandering around under control of the British at the time, and some semblance of order was already beginning to manifest itself. But it couldn't. Nothing could really hide the utter horror which was evoked by this camp of death. I was incidentally later. I visited this this camp a few years ago when I was visiting within the framework of a visit to NATO forces. The area now is a training ground for armoured forces in Western Europe. But at that time it was a most terrible sight, a most shocking revelation to the human being of man's inhumanity to man.
Were there other Israelis or Israelis to be on the scene at that time?
I don't know if there were any on the scene. Of course, I wouldn't particularly have known. There was certainly none in our division that I knew of. But in the fighting on the Rhine, Major Ben Dunkelman, as he was then, the Canadian Army fighting in the Reichswald and the Hochwald, he won the Distinguished Service Order, the DSO, in his fighting, and as you know, he later commanded the 7th Brigade in Sahel in the conquest of Galilee in the War of Liberation. And later also, I remember in the fighting for Bremen, Dr. Isaiah Morris was in the 3rd British Division at that time, won the Military Cross, the MC, just north of the area of Bergen-Belsen. He later was killed in the when serving in the Golani Brigade in the fighting in Galilee in our War of Independence. They were the only two that I can at the moment remember. There may have been a few more. Later, of course, when the Jewish Brigade came up into the Low Countries, a detachment of the Jewish Brigade was in Bergen-Belsen, and I used to meet them there at the time.
Thank you very much, Aluf Herzog.